Startups are an emotional roller coaster, and the most gut-wrenching parts are during fundraising. One moment you're riding high, and the next you feel like you're about to die. When we're pitching, we're often on the edge of our seats, and we're working really hard to prove ourselves right in the face of investor skepticism. But is this defensive stance useful, or might it do more harm than good? In today's episode, we dive deep on these questions with Nestor Solari, co-founder and CEO of Sigo Seguros, and we explore the turbulent feelings that come up during the fundraising process and the impact they can have on our success. We get into what happens when an investor pushes back, the ways that we typically handle ourselves, and how we can escape the trap that can cripple any fundraising effort. Let's dive in. Hey Nestor, great to see you today.
Hey Brian, good to see you too.
So just to give the audience a little bit of a sense of who you are, Nestor, you're the founder and CEO of a great company called Sigo. You and I have been working together for some time now. And what's really interesting about our history is that we worked together for a while, we took a break, and then when you came back to pick up the work with me, the company had really shifted. You guys had just started to really hit the accelerator in your growth. And so as your coach, I've had a lot of fun just watching the different phases of the company and its journey and the twists and turns, and of course just watching you grow through that whole process. And so I'm just excited to get on this particular session with you on the show. And I just wanted to give you a chance to just introduce yourself and of course maybe talk a little bit about just what we're here to do today.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for having me. Always a pleasure to spend some time together. I guess quick background on me, born and raised in New Jersey, parents are Uruguayan immigrants. I think after working my whole career in finance, saw an opportunity to help the immigrant communities with better insurance or a better auto insurance option. And kind of that's what launched my journey into building Sigo during business school. I think as I started researching kind of the founder journey and following founders I really respected and looked up to, coaching was one thing that came up, and particularly a founder that I had been following and had a lot of respect for, spoke very highly of you. And so thankful we were able to get in touch and start working together. I think it's been an incredible journey building. And so very professionally rewarding, but I think very personally rewarding as well. And a lot of that thanks to a lot of the work we've done. As I reflected on the things weighing down on me and the things that I wanted to talk to you about, obviously a big part of my job is fundraising and having investor conversations from day one through maybe the life of the company, but particularly through these early stages. And no matter how well the company is doing and how strongly I feel about our performance and how strong my conviction in the opportunity is, I tend to find myself losing a lot of energy in some investor conversations that might not go the way I expected them to go. And so I thought we might be able to explore that a bit together and dig and see kind of maybe what biases I have or what things might be impacting my mood or my performance ultimately.
Yeah, great. So you're no stranger to fundraising. I know you've really kind of been through that process quite a few times. You guys have raised actually quite a bit of money. So I know that also you're pretty good at it too. Yeah. And so you mentioned this energy thing, how it can feel draining for you. And I know that there's this concern around performance. I'm wondering if you can maybe just like expand on that. Talk a little bit about what you experience in some of these situations where, it doesn't meet your expectation, energy shifts, and just go back into this part where it's like, oh yeah, now I'm not performing the way I want. Just say more about that.
Yeah. And I think it's, a lot of it starts with kind of psyching myself up, I think, for getting myself excited for a lot of these conversations. But I think going into conversations, especially recently, I've been very confident, again, about the business. I think I've been very excited about the business. and I go in expecting to share amazing metrics and growth and what have you with an investor. And I find that if that doesn't seem to land the way I intend, or if the investor's reaction doesn't seem as positive as I would expect, that feels in my mind like it throws me off balance. I think I kind of go in with a clear game plan. Fundraising is a game of being meticulously detail oriented and planning out your investor list and your materials and being very thoughtful about how you do all of that and putting it all together. And so it feels like when you go from this structured Excel file and data room and a kind of clear framework or equation for a good pitch deck for your Series A, then I kind of go into maybe this less structured conversation or environment, expecting that kind of my A plus B is going to equal C, and when it equals X, I find to kind of get maybe thrown off balance, and I find that maybe translates itself to being flustered in a conversation or not answering questions as crisply as I would like to. And I feel like maybe that kind of sets me into maybe some sort of spiral, but then one conversation goes poorly, and then it seems like that bleeds into the next conversation, and then it bleeds into my preparation for next week. And whenever I take a second to reflect on it, I know there's a lot of factors outside of my control here. But it tends to feel like a kind of a bit of that failure. And I think as founders, a lot of us have a fear of failure, and kind of filling in that conversation maybe is a peek into what happens if you don't put this fundraise together.
Okay, so you're already jumping into the I'm feeling like a failure part. Yeah, you're skipping ahead. Okay, so so let me reflect a little bit on what I just heard you say, Nestor. So one of the things that jumped out at me was the word expectation. So the way that you framed it, it sounded like, there's a game that I'm playing, which is I put together the right pitch with the right narrative and the data room and the process and the investor list. And once I execute these steps in the right sequence, then, it's like I hit these keystrokes and then out comes money, right? Not to be too reductive, but, and then when the reality doesn't meet your expectation, you talked about that messy, unstructured interaction. You go in thinking, if I say the right things, the eyes will light up, and then there's going to be the money. Then in that unstructured place where perhaps it feels a lot more dynamic, right? I don't know what's going to happen in here. That's where it feels like you lose your footing a little bit, and your mind starts to go into more of this kind of negative, contracted place. Like, it's not going well. Maybe I'm going to fail. That sort of thing, right? So the big thing I'm hearing is this expectation thing. I'm wondering, just as I make that simple reflection, what's coming up for you as I point out this expectation component?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we talk about as a team at Sigo is kind of setting expectations with each other, with ourselves, with our clients, with our customers, and it's funny, and sometimes you kind of don't realize the expectations you're setting for yourself, but that resonates for me. And I guess what that takes me to is, well, if my expectations aren't met, why am I? It feels like I might immediately start searching for, okay, what's the right formula here? What's the right next step, or how do I get this back on track when maybe it's not off track? That's kind of what what came up for me is kind of, what does this look like if I go into it without expectations, or with less expectations, or more flexible expectations?
Have you ever been in a conversation with somebody where it felt like they were coming into it with a whole bunch of expectations of how it was going to turn out? Like they had an agenda
so. Sure.
with like how it was going to go?
Sure. Yeah.
How did that feel for you?
Off-putting is the first word that comes to mind. If I know someone comes to the call with an agenda, you're kind of on guard. And I mean, I guess, especially in the check writer, check receiver kind of founder, builder, investor type relationship, it almost seems like there's those preconceived notion of an agenda kind of baked in.
Right. Yeah, there's some dance that we do, right? Some part to play.
But if we take it out of that context, kind of being in a conversation with someone that seems to already have an agenda or have a way that they think this should go, kind of puts me on the defensive a bit.
And how do you start to feel toward that person in particular in that moment?
Well, you kind of almost get the kind of the sense that they're trying to manipulate you, right? I think that getting put in that guard, also you kind of, it's antagonistic almost, right? It's you feel like you should be putting pressure back almost. That you're kind of need to slow this agenda down a bit, or slow this person down, to make sure you're not being taken advantage of.
Yeah. So like the word that came up for me was like, that feels adversarial.
Yeah.
Right. You versus me. Let's see who's going to win.
Yeah.
So yeah, you got a look on your face. For those who are just listening to audio, they can't see this, but I'm curious, like what's running through your mind and your heart as this is processing through you?
Well, I think the first thing that I'm thinking about is kind of this adversarial nature of these conversations. It really doesn't feel like that is how it is with my largest investors and with most successful founders and their best kind of investor relationships. And kind of adversarial doesn't seem to quite accurately describe kind of how the relationship should be, right? Ideally, we're both winning. And there's a couple scenarios where one wins and the other one loses. But I think in the best outcomes, the investors and the founders kind of are both kind of aligned and trying to move in the same direction, right?
Right.
And so I wonder how it gets there from here a bit, is kind of what I was trying to work through in my mind, and was putting that look on my face.
Yeah. Great. So I think you're totally right. Ultimately, when you're raising money, you're looking for partners. You're looking for people who are aligned with your vision. They're excited about your vision. They're going to support you, right, with capital and resources and all sorts of things, right? To start that off from an adversarial frame feels like an uphill battle, right? Because it becomes like a you versus me thing, and that's pretty far away from, hey, we're on the same team, we're allies now, right? So I guess the question that's coming up for me now is, when you find yourself in those situations, right, where it ends up feeling a little adversarial, this is an open question, but like what is it that's driving that on your end?
And I'm thinking about a couple of different conversations. And I'm thinking about how, okay, when I've felt this, so what memories is feeling bringing back? I think there are a couple. I think sometimes it might feel like it's triggered by, I don't know if it's a question or a reaction to something I say. which I think is the first one, where I'll present something as a truth or as my experience or as something as I know, and then the person across the table maybe the story I'm telling myself is that they're being cynical and disagreeing with me just to be kind of play devil's advocate, possibly.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that kind of sets us up to butt heads. And that feels like it might be the most common experience or most common story I have in my head about when this happens.
Can you, I'm wondering if you can maybe put yourself in a specific situation where that happened recently, one where this kind of feels real to you. You don't need to name names, of course.
Sure. I think one that feels common, almost like a recurring dream at this right now, is I think in the auto insurance sector in general, it's very competitive. Some see it often as a kind of commodity product.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the truth is it's quite nuanced, and there's a lot of variation in auto insurance and the type of coverage. And I think that's something I've learned through my experience in working with immigrant communities and selling lower coverage limits versus maybe what I'm used to buying from Geico. And so a lot of times when I try to communicate that nuance or that difference, I think I sense, or the story I tell myself about how others react, is that they don't believe me. They believe that these large competitors will easily put us out of the business once we prove that we can do this profitably or whatever it is.
Okay.
And that seems to be something that I've practiced a lot since early days in trying to explain the nuance and speak around, but still something that feels like it's a challenge to get an investor to digest, especially if they're like learning about this segment for the first time.
Okay, so you've got this experience where you've gleaned some important nuanced insights about this market, and then you go into these meetings and you say, hey, like, here's something really interesting that we've learned, that we understand a certain truth about the space that we're working in. We'd like to share it with you. And then the response is, almost, it sounds like there's a dismissal. There's a, yeah, but I think you guys are going to get crushed, right? And I want to see if we can maybe then take that moment that I'm describing and zoom in a little bit into your experience here. So like in the moment where that resistance comes up, no, here's why that's not going to work, etc. Right? What do you notice you start to feel in your internal reaction there?
Get defensive. Almost feels like I lean in and put my shoulder down a bit. Feels a certain tightness in my shoulders and chest. Feels like my almost knee-jerk or immediate response is to start trying to spit out the dozen reasons why I quote unquote know that they're wrong.
Okay. So there's a defensiveness. Your body starts to shift. It's like almost like it's kind of like almost collapsing a little bit, if I heard that correctly. There's a little bit of a curling. There's a need to defend something. We could spend some time naming that, but you're on the defense, and then also like, but wait, let me explain why you're wrong, right? Which then sounds like it's like a little bit of this back and forth, right? And so, if you can just stay in that space for a moment, that defensiveness, connect with that defensiveness now. Now I want to ask, underneath that, what are you starting to believe about yourself, and what are you starting to believe about that person in that situation?
So this is maybe a little mixed between what I believe and they believe, or maybe what I believe about what they believe.
Sure. Yeah. What you're projecting onto them. Sure.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's, well, I must not be credible as a founder if they don't believe what I'm saying to them. Or this investor is not sophisticated or is not, or is intentionally obfuscating my point because they have some bias against what me or what I'm doing. The other one that comes up is kind of almost kind of a need or it feels like a thirst to prove myself right. It's almost, if this person doesn't believe me, then that means I'm wrong. Whereas that saying that out loud, almost like, well, I don't need them to believe me for me to believe myself and know that this is my truth or my experience.
Yeah, I know you get that on an intellectual level.
Yeah, that's the challenge.
Yeah, but it sounds like, just to paraphrase, if this person, like you see this data point, this person doesn't seem to believe me, and now this must mean something about me. I'm not credible. I'm not believable. I must be wrong here. And I just want to slow down and notice, just let us both notice how you jump from this person doesn't get what I'm saying or disagrees, and then the conclusion jumps right to, oh, that must mean something about me. That must mean something about my own competence or credibility. And then the move to defend oneself, to prove oneself.
So what that makes me think about is, well, if I were competent and credible, then why wouldn't they believe, right? And then I guess there's a step between me being competent and credible and seeming in another person's eyes to be competent and credible. Those are two different things. And then there's also whether it seems or I am, there's other reasons why they may not believe something despite my competence and credibility.
Sure. Yeah, I can see you jump into the alternative reasons. Absolutely. What I hear is that there's an experience that you have around this feeling of, oh, I'm not credible. I need to prove myself. Where else have you felt that? Does that feel familiar to you, even outside of this context?
Reminds me of interview processes throughout my career before being a founder. Interviewing and not getting the job. That's a strong feeling.
Yeah. What's the feeling if you were to name it?
Oof. Is it inadequacy? I think is the thing is, well, I know I can do this job and I'm trying to communicate that, but I can't. So I'm inadequate in some form. And then I don't get the job. So that confirms that this inadequacy.
Where did you first get that message? Some sense that you're inadequate.
Going back, failing tests, or I can't remember necessarily getting an F on a test ever, but I do remember not getting the A's that I expected to or wanted to.
Oh, okay.
Let me see if there's something further back I can. Even kind of maybe like friend groups as a kid, it feels like that's like you're kind of embarrassed in school for whatever reason, and I can't come up with a specific example, but you think about like, it almost feels similarly to the interview. It feels like when you're a kid and you tell the girl you like that you like them, and there's no reciprocation there, right? It almost feels like by default, a lot of the investor conversations feel like it's almost like an opt-in by the founder, and then it's up to the investor to make the decision. Until at some point that power dynamic shifts, right?
Right. It feels like there's this person who has power over you. I need to get their approval. I need to win their approval.
Right.
And then when you don't get that, it feels like there's that feeling of inadequacy. I didn't win the approval because I'm somehow inadequate.
Yeah.
And when you're in the middle of that feeling live, what's the urge, right? What's the thing that your system is like just springing to want to do then?
feeling frustration, feeling grinding my teeth, maybe sadness, tears even. Just kind of like of a level of frustration.
Yeah. I wonder if you can connect with that a little bit. The teary feeling, the sadness. And what's that bringing up for you?
Whenever that sadness comes to mind, and I don't know if I'm feeling bad about myself, or I feel like I'm being a little too mean to myself. I think one thing from previous coaching, I think of myself as a little kid with those emotions.
Sure.
And just feeling that compassion. But that's kind of what those, feeling that emotion and feeling that I may be exposing myself to it, or kind of putting myself in that headspace or that position. It feels almost like I'm not shaming myself, I'm punishing myself. And then that kind of makes me step off and be like, well, chill out, man. You're
sure.
Don't be so hard on yourself a little bit is
Yeah.
the thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. So you just walked us through a kind of a series of steps here, right? The way you start to relate to yourself or different parts of yourself. But I don't want us to necessarily skip over the part where you feel that frustration and the sadness. I think I hear that it's like, okay, like don't be so hard on yourself. Yeah.
I think one thing that's triggered there is, well, I don't want to be too hard on myself because I don't want to feel this.
Feel what exactly?
Feel this kind of frustration or this sadness or this kind of this gritting my teeth, kind of fighting, crying kind of feeling.
What I hear in that is there's like I'm gritting my teeth hard to hold back from something. Like it's like you're clenching so as to not feel something under that. What's that?
Almost, and maybe it's that sadness or that and what it's funny that just that reaction to not let yourself feel this, feel anything unpleasant. Seems like my first reaction is, let me try to do something or say something to not let myself feel that.
I think you're doing it right now.
Yeah.
What happens if you just allow any of that in for a moment?
I feel lighter.
You might ask this part of yourself that feels sad, what does it want you to know?
I don't know if this is just the reaction to not feeling it, but it maybe kind of don't be so hard on yourself. Don't inflict this.
As in, you're sad about how hard you are on yourself?
Maybe, or that I'm sad because I'm being hard on myself for not achieving what I expected to achieve in that moment. And so I tell myself that I'm not good enough, or that I'm not performing as well as I should be. And that makes me sad. But then kind of exploring that sadness, it's like, well, maybe you need to reevaluate that reaction, right? Reevaluate that. It's not the lower standard. I think that it starts getting really cloudy when you think about kind of keeping my standards high and working hard and making myself kind of outperform.
Sure.
Versus this kind of maybe extreme, like hard line stance of anything not going my way is immediately my fault and needs to be corrected.
Well, there's a world where you can have a lot of high standards and really seek to achieve without really ripping into yourself when you don't actually succeed in some of those things. If I'm tracking you, there's some part of you that feels sad that you're not hitting some of those outcomes. Is that accurate?
I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's wrong with feeling sad about those things?
I smile because I think this is that fear, pain, sad avoidance oftentimes creates a lot of these challenges, and just not being willing to feel something in a moment or sit with something in a moment. And so I start reacting and kind of go on autopilot a bit.
What I hear is that the disappointment and the sadness in that moment where you don't meet the expectation feels so bad that you resist it, and then that resistance creates the knee-jerk reaction, like, I have to defend myself now. I have to prove myself now.
Yeah.
Does that land?
It does. Just always kind of coming back to this, a lot of the unwanted behaviors that we work through together, I think, stem from avoiding a feeling or kind of maybe escaping that consciousness almost. And
Sure.
hey, I don't want to sit with this because it's uncomfortable or it doesn't feel nice.
Yeah.
But not that what you do to avoid that feels too much better, right?
Sure. But it's familiar.
Yeah.
So let's play with this. How might these situations change, these conversations, these interactions with investors change if you didn't fight yourself so hard? Like, fight that sad reaction, fight the disappointment, instead you just allowed yourself to have that.
It feels like they would slow down a bit, which might play to my favor to be able to clearly communicate what the point I want to get through, and maybe owning that conversation a little more. But the first thing that really came to mind was, right now it feels like these become a bit of a chain of events where it kind of keeps compounding and just kind of like running through and pushing through and just doing what you're feeling or want to do and through, and then hoping it kind of comes out on the other end. Versus works out on at the end, like, versus almost handling these more on a conversation per conversation basis and maybe unlinking them.
It's like you go on autopilot through the rest of your conversations almost. It's like something takes over and you're like, well, I got to just kind of like power through these now.
Right.
I would imagine that would leave you feeling probably less connected to not just yourself, but also to the person that you're talking to.
Exhausted thinking about it.
Yeah.
Just have these kind of back-to-back phone call days, and that's just not giving yourself that space or that room to breathe and reflect and sit with yourself for a moment.
What comes up for me is the word presence. Like, when we enter into that autopilot state, often because there's some feeling that we really don't want to be with, we lose presence with ourselves, and we certainly lose presence with the people that we're with. And those conversations lose a lot of their dynamic potential. Very, very hard for us to dance in the moment with whatever's coming up, because our agenda is just to move on through there. Let's get to the thing here, right? And we all experience that when we lose presence, and that starts with ourselves, right? We lose presence, and then everyone else around us can feel that.
It's funny. One of our values at Sigo is to be engaged, and I think it precisely speaks to kind of being present with each other, and making that time together valuable by being there with each other. But I think a lot of times it's in the kind of, especially in the virtual world and the phone calls, it kind of feels like you're kind of alone, even though you're on kind of the other side with somebody, and even not being engaged with yourself by yourself, like avoiding those feelings. Seems like it's almost like a kind of self-perpetuating kind of vicious cycle.
Oh, sure. Yeah. We're constantly inviting others to engage in certain behaviors, right? Like we model, so much of the behavior that then occurs around us. So I want to ask you, what are you seeing at the moment that wasn't so clear when we started?
A couple of things come up for me. I think one is maybe thinking about the triggers here and thinking about, okay, different ways to maybe recognize when I'm in that triggered state, and whether it's taking a breath or taking a moment, kind of thinking about, okay, how can I come out of it? But I think kind of going into that triggered state is something that I feel that I've had it really appreciated. I felt, okay, I'm going into this level-headed and I'm approaching this in a straightforward fashion, but the outcome is what's weighing on me. Whereas it's obviously feels a bit more complex in that it's not really the outcome that's weighing on me, it's the whole process, and kind of adds up. And so I think if at the beginning of this, I probably would have said the outcomes of these conversations are weighing down on me. Whereas now it feels like maybe, well, my reaction to others' reactions kind of take me out of being present, which leads me down this kind of maybe dark alley.
Right.
And so, whereas before I may have been more prone to accept, well, like this is just what happens when I have a bad conversation. Maybe say, well, was that a bad conversation really? It's okay if it was a bad conversation, and it's okay if I feel bad about whatever happened, but that doesn't translate to all these conversations having to be bad, doesn't translate to my credibility or my confidence or my conviction in what I'm doing.
Maybe it doesn't have to translate into this adversarial thing. Now I have to really prove myself.
Yeah. What if I was okay not knowing exactly what they thought? And even if I knew what they thought, what if I was okay with it, even if it wasn't what I think?
I'll simplify that for you. What if I was just okay?
Sounds tough. What if I was just okay?
That, by the way, also includes whatever the emotional state is. What if my sadness was okay? What if my disappointment was okay?
What's coming for me is thinking about, okay, if my disappointment or my sadness is okay, yet still want to use those as tools, right? You would kind of use sadness to push towards happiness, or you use disappointment to push towards success or accomplishment. Feels like the toolkit that I've long used. And maybe it isn't necessarily as effective of a toolkit anymore.
Well, what you just said was like, I need to go, let me go take this emotion and change it or fix it or something. Versus, what if it was just okay for me to be sad right now? And then if I just allow myself to feel that, eventually it'll move through me and then I can move on.
Yeah, you kind of look at, and I think happy and sad is a good a good one to play with, right? Because you almost think, okay, if I'm feeling sad and I don't do anything about it, then I might never be happy, right? Right. Okay, if you're sad and it goes through you, you can also be happy in the future, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a result of you forcing your sadness away.
Right. Yeah, emotions are kind of funny. That impulse is, uh-oh, I'm feeling this feeling. I better go fix it.
Yeah.
And in my experience, that's not really how emotions work. They're not there to be done away with or to be treated as a problem. They might point to certain things that matter to us. They point to needs and help us move toward the things that we need and that we value. But, when we treat them as problems inherently, that's where all of the avoidance behaviors start to come in, or the numbing behaviors start to come in, or the defensive behaviors start to come in, right? But if we knew that the feeling itself, it's okay. Let me have it. Let me see what it's about. Welcome it, maybe. And we start to shift the way that we relate to it. And then all the avoidance stuff doesn't become necessary anymore.
And the avoided stuff is where the problem lies, right?
That's up for you to decide.
I'll make sure I'm okay with my feelings.
Let me just check in with you as we start to wrap here. So take a step back. We kind of covered a lot here. What would it look like for you just to move this forward a little bit? Like take this forward.
I guess the one thing that I'd take away from here, it's okay to feel my feelings, and let's kind of practice doing that. So kind of some sort of maybe mindfulness practice, or some kind of just some checking in with myself on my feelings and my reactions, I think is what I need to do, and kind of maybe be more intentional about it. I think this coaching space is always very helpful to slow down and think about these things. And I think I need to be more conscious about working this into my personal toolkit, because it feels like we were able to just kind of unpack something and kind of bring it to this core issue of avoiding this feeling. And I think the key thing is working on not avoiding the feeling.
Yeah. And just to build on top of that, there is the fundamental checking in. Can I check in and see what emotions are present here? What's wanting my attention, what wants to be felt here. And I like to use the word welcome. Can I welcome this? That there's an activeness to that, right? Rather than it's like, I'm not going to resist. There's a welcoming, and then see what happens there.
You know what else comes up for me when you say welcoming? Kind of even honoring kind of the evolution of the human brain, the fact that those feelings are there for a reason, that it's tough for all of us to maybe comprehend, but being okay with it and kind of sitting with it and exploring it and appreciating it.
That feels like a good note to end on.
Thank you, as always, Brian.
Most people know that raising money requires you to tell a great story, but it also requires you to connect with the investor on the other side. That's really hard to do when you get thrown off during a meeting. Make no mistake, savvy investors will push back and ask questions. It's part of their job. In Nestor's case, when he got pushback, he internalized it as inadequacy and rejection, as well as feelings of sadness and frustration. All of these are perfectly normal reactions. The trouble comes when we clamp down on those emotions and then we get really rigid in the meeting. And then we start to bring in unproductive energy to the rest of that conversation as well as subsequent meetings. In our session, once Nestor allowed himself to feel his own sadness, it started to get lighter for him. His feelings had less weight and his stories had less grip on him. The welcoming of his inner experience led to more freedom and resourcefulness for him. As the saying goes, what you resist persists. Fundraising is a full contact sport. You have to be willing to fully embrace the experience, emotions and all. So if you are or are about to go fundraising, ask yourself if you're willing to fully embrace the experience. And if you're not, ask yourself what you would require in order to do so. Thank you for listening to Slow Down to Speed Up. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate it in your favorite podcasting app. And if you're a founder looking to get to the next level through coaching or come on the show, please contact me at dashingleadership.com.